I'm the education coordinator here at Honey Creek, and I help put on programs or find people who find people to put on programs. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris, who will introduce our speaker today.
My name is Chris Myers, and on behalf of the Kelley Creek Foundation Education Committee, I'd like to welcome you. We are very excited and pleased to welcome Dr. Kelley Deetz today. I'm going to read her bio because there's no way I could do this justice, so if you'll bear with me. Dr. Kelley Fanto Deetz is a historical archaeologist and historian, a research associate at the James River Institute of Archaeology. She holds a BA in Black Studies from College of William and Mary and an MA in African American Studies and a PhD in African Diaspora Studies from the University of California at Berkeley. She specializes in early African American culture, African diaspora, archaeology, slavery, visual and material culture, cultural landscapes, cultural tourism, memorials, and public history. Dr. Deetz has taught at UC Berkeley, Randolph College, Roanoke College, UVA, and this semester is teaching a public history course at Lynchburg College. She also facilitates dialogues related to racial tensions at colleges and universities and works as a historical consultant for several museum sites. In 2015, she was the material cultural advisor for the film Birth of the Nation and has recently partnered with National Geographic to work on projects related to Nat Turner. Dr. Deetz is writing a cover story for National Geographic History Magazine, January 2017, entitled Nat Turner's Bones, which is due out in December, and was a contributor to Birth of the Nation, Nat Turner, and the Making of the Movement by Simon & Schuster in 2016. Her manuscript, Bound to the Fire, Virginia's Enslaved Cooks and the Birth of an American Myth, is due for publication in the fall of 2016. Please join me in welcoming her.
I haven't been in Charlottesville since I left in August, and it's really nice to be back. And additionally, as you heard from my bio, the last year I've spent so much of my time giving lectures on Nat Turner. And this is really exciting for me to come back to the book that I wrote that's going to come out in about 11 months, to begin sort of talking about it, getting the excitement up. I gave a lecture yesterday at Stratford Hall on my book as well. It was oversold, people are excited about this. And I think more than any other time in my life, and maybe many of yours, I think that the topic that I deal with, dealing with Black lives, both historically and the legacy of slavery and race in this country, is even more important to be talking about right now. So we've been at a crossroads, but we are at a deeper crossroads than I think we've been ever, possibly, at least in the last century. So we are here. I am very happy to be here again. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a lot about enslaved cooks, about their lives. I'm not going to give the Monticello narrative because I think if you guys live here, you've heard it a million times. I am going to touch on it, but similarly, in my book, I focus on the average men and women that worked in these kitchens, to break away from the great man, the great plantation theory, and really think about the men and women who were traded regularly from plantation to plantation in the state. I'm going to begin by a sort of sobering reading from my book. I'm going to read this first, and then I'll lead right into my lecture. Surry County, Virginia, 1860. It was the eve of the Civil War, and Sookie went to bed every night thinking about the labor of her days. Cooking on a Surry County plantation was a stressful task that occupied all of her 5 senses and consumed almost every moment of her life. She provided several meals a day to the white family who enslaved her, and to whomever came to visit. Food was more than sustenance. It was at the core of Virginia's hospitality. Her friends in the field worked from sunup to sundown, while Sookie remained bound to the fire in the big house's kitchen 24 hours a day. She was forced to cook multiple meals that were both scheduled and spontaneous. Up every day before dawn, Sookie baked bread for the morning, cooked soups for the afternoons, and created divine feasts for the evenings. She roasted meats, she made jellies, cooked puddings, and created desserts for every free person who passed through her enslaver's plantation. She lived in the kitchen. She slept upstairs, above the hearth during the winters, and often outside come summertime. Her children learned to cook and work in the big house, and were always under the watch of the white family. Private moments were rare, as was the ability to truly rest. Sookie rose early to bake, cooked all day, and went to bed with the next day's menu both on her mind and physically on the large hearth on the first floor of her kitchen quarter. Cooking for a Virginia plantation was a challenging task, one that required culinary talents, nuanced social skills, and a strong physicality. The labor was intense. Lifting huge pots of water, standing for hours by the open fire, working hours that bled into the night with no space for recluse. Sookie was a typical enslaved cook, and undoubtedly worked herself to death. Cooking provided her and her family with a unique status in the bonds of enslavement, but it came at a high cost. In 1860, Sookie died at the age of 50 from a hemorrhaged wound, likely from overexerting herself for the sake of Virginia's famous hospitality. So I start with that because a lot of people come to my talk because food is cool, right? Like, oh, I want to learn about food. Food is what, I call it sometimes the gateway drug of talking about slavery. A lot of people that don't want to deal with the hard stuff, the things that I read and think about every day, they'll come here and talk about food. It's just sterile enough to be safe, right? So I start with this to remind everyone that this is not just a book, and these aren't just stories about food and the glamour of what we think of when we think of sort of the big plantation house and all the balls, right? But it has to do with the people who were held in bondage, who were forced to make that lifestyle possible, right? So I just like to start with that sobering moment because we're going to have, my talk goes up and down, right? Pride, abuse, struggles, and survival. But we need to start with a very sobering story about this woman whose story reflects not only women and men in slavery, but a lot of people who still to this day work for under a living wage and are dealing with horrible conditions. So today I'm going to be talking about enslaved cooks, their kitchens, not simply the food. I'm going to focus on how enslaved African Americans used food and their skills to find dignity, and how they used such skills to survive and persevere slavery, right? Talking about things like slavery and pride, dignity. How can you hold yourself up high while you're a slave, right? So this is something that we need to be able to understand. The world isn't simple binaries. You can be oppressed, but you can still hold your chin high. And this is something I'm going to be driving home to you as I read my slides today. Also, how their legacy is misunderstood and how we need to redefine it. The title of my book, I have changed it now because I've been messing with it so much. It's Bound to the Fire, Virginia's Enslaved Plantation Cooks and the Birth of an American Myth. Because there is so much misunderstanding about the people that worked in the house. My work redefines these people's roles and turns the whole sort of dichotomy on its head. Let's see if I can not turn the projector on. I'm scared that it's going to skip. Okay. I start out with a little bit of background. People always ask me, how did you get into this, right? So this picture up here is kind of funny. It's a horrible old picture from, I think, the 1950s or 60s. These are my parents. My father was an archaeologist. He was one of the first archaeologists to ever work on African American sites. He is considered, he passed a long time ago, the forefather of historical archaeology. And he really broke some of the early barriers in telling the stories about enslaved African American people. And so I grew up in a house where we talked about the lives of enslaved people, where history was very much a part of our daily conversations at the dinner table. We thought about the past, what it means to us now, what it meant to people then. Then I spent 10 years of my life as a professional cook. So I have sort of, being raised in a multiracial family, learning about history and the importance of material culture in the past. Then this career as a cook before I decided to be an academic. Now I don't know what I'm doing. I'm floating around and freelancing and giving talks and fighting mice. It takes all kinds, right? So these are my two, intellectual parents, in a sense, for the book that I wrote. Now, I got to graduate school, UC Berkeley, and I was trying to figure out what on earth I was going to write my dissertation on, right? And so, I knew I wanted to work in Virginia. I went to William & Mary. I was very invested in coming back here and testifying on behalf of the people who didn't have voices during slavery. So I knew I wanted to do that. So I found myself, as a lot of historians do, nerding out, going online to the Colonial Williamsburg website and looking at the 18th century newspapers and just reading them. All of a sudden, I found the index, and the index had a whole section on slaves, and I mean like pages and pages and pages and pages. So I started looking through. All of a sudden, it was, slaves as butchers. That's interesting. It's just for sale ads. Slaves as carpenters. Interesting, not my thing. All of a sudden, I hit slaves as cooks. There were, over 100 sale ads just in the very beginning of looking at that newspaper, with their age, with their worth, describing why it's important to have a cook. And within seconds, I had at least 50 questions I had about these people who worked in these kitchens. So that's how I found my project. And sadly, when my father brought me out to Virginia when I was 17 years old, I grew up in Berkeley, California, and it could not be any different than Plantation, Virginia. He brought me to Flowerdew 100 down in Prince George County, south side of the river, and he brought me onto this plantation, took me on some tours, and I would immediately, because I started working as a cook when I was 12, so by the time I was 17, I was 5 years in, right? I would run over to the kitchens and look in the windows, and sadly, and this still happened until very recently, until I started working on this, and for most of you as well, who did I imagine when I looked in those windows? Right? So I found myself with this project with incredible resources. I'm an archaeologist as well, so I thought, oh my goodness, I know people that have dug up kitchens. What are the kitchens going to tell me about these people's lives? What does the landscape tell me about how these people lived? And then the written records were fantastic because cooks were valued more, and they were being sold and described to one another. And I thought to myself too, these mistresses in these plantations wrote all these letters back and forth. What are they talking about? Food, and the few people that they managed inside of the house. So this myth that I want to talk about for a second is critical to the pivot that I make in my work. Enslaved cooks, the Aunt Jemimas, the Uncle Rastuses, are considered to be, by many people, submissive, less connected to the black folks in the quarter, more culturally similar to the white family who enslaved them. It's an incredible insult in the black community to call somebody Uncle Tom or a house slave. It's used as a way to dismiss somebody from having any kind of cultural connection to the roots in Africa, right? So these people are deemed as these sort of whitewashed, submissive, illiterate, loyal house slaves, right? This is very much alive in today's knowledge. And these assumptions come from many things. The biggest thing that started this was during the abolitionist movement. You had abolitionists saying, what on earth are you guys doing down there? And the South saying, oh, but our slaves are happy. Look at my, Aunt Mary, who was my nanny in the house, and my cook. She's very, very happy, right? So this narrative of these loyal house slaves was born out of a struggle on whether or not to end slavery or not. And enslaved folks had no voice in that. It was the people that enslaved them that were speaking on their behalf to defend the institution of slavery and the ways in which they ran their house. It also came from cartoons. One of the things when my son was born 9 years ago, I thought to myself, ooh, I'm going to go show him some Tom and Jerry cartoons. Oh my goodness. And I don't know if those ones that are on YouTube now just weren't playing in the 80s when I was growing up, but they are nasty. So I thought to myself, oh my goodness, like all these generations of people being fed these black-faced, very racist depictions of these women and men working in these kitchens. Films, of course. And I want to say the most explicit and provocative, oh wait, sorry, do that. Come on, mouse. Okay, be a little lag here. this stuff called Black Americana. Now I have to tell you, this happens every time I give this talk. I talk about these artifacts, I describe them, we get into it, and one person, at least in the audience, will either come up to me afterwards and say, "Can I get your address? Because I got them, like, it belonged to my grandmother, and I don't know what to do with it, and it's a horrible thing, I don't want it in my house." So I have a whole entire wall in my office of these things that people have given me over the years. It's my sort of racist wall of shame that I keep with a big old sign, and I'm like, please ask me about these, because I don't want people thinking that I'm sitting there, worshiping these black-faced dolls. But it's very much a part of a generation of folks that have these things in their houses. Who here has seen these before? They're everywhere. They're in all the antique stores. They actually go for a lot of money right now. So when people give them to me, I'm like, wow, are you sure you could sell it? But I think it's better to have them as a teaching tool anyways. So these items did a lot of things. They started coming about after slavery ended, became really, really popular during the Jim Crow era. And they normalized black bodies, the image of a black body in the kitchen, right? Slavery was over, but remember those good old days, right? When Aunt so-and-so was in the house. And for a lot of people who grew up with black maids and cooks in their house, even that are alive today, very much have these stories about having, the movie The Help. So it normalized having a black body in the kitchen, and also a lot of these things, everyone's smiling, right? So it's kind of like an easy way to be like, oh, it wasn't that bad. See, here's my proof. We have these little ceramic dolls that, make me feel less guilty about the past, right? It's just what they are. They satisfied America's appetite for black labor, like I said, and they became this in Aunt Jemima, just the image of her alone. You can still go to Kroger or wherever else and find her pancake mix. Her hair has been straightened, her skin has been lightened, and she's a lot thinner. But still, Aunt Jemima is making your life easier, right? The advertisement still, like, you have a quick pancake mix. What does that mean to have quick food with a throwback to slavery on it? That is a direct relationship to the ease of having enslaved labor during the period of slavery. So this image, these images, have been so ingrained into our culture that we have forgotten to actually ask who these people are. Is this all we have? And when I first started to study scholars, I had fellowships at Colonial Williamsburg, and they were sitting there like, we already know about this, don't we? And I thought to myself, no we don't, just watch. And I have found out a lot of stuff about these people. So for the remainder of the lecture, I'm going to start big and go small. So I do cultural landscape stuff, and I also do archaeology. So we're going to start talking about the landscape as a stage, what you can look for when you go to these plantation museums, and you can start to read how power is inscribed in the landscape. And then I'm going to take you all the way down through other stages, histories and everything else, down to the nitty-gritty things that were found in the archaeology sites of these kitchens in Virginia. So this, of course, is, excuse me, this right here is Shirley Plantation. It's the earliest plantation in Virginia. It is one of the quintessential plantation homes. You get the big mansion here, you drive up, the water's back there, the kitchen's right here to the right. Here's a very well-known painting as well of a plantation. You've got all the domestic servants, right, enslaved folks, all right next to the big house. Now, typically people say, oh, but the kitchens look so nice, it must not have been that bad, right? Well, the kitchens, for one, have survived because they were built out of better material, because they were part of the front stage of these people's homes. You think about these plantations, hundreds, sometimes thousands of acres. The field quarters are going to look a mess, but no one's looking at those. So the houses that are closer to the big house are going to look a lot better because they're part of the presentation of your wealth, right? So because of that, they have, luckily for me, survived a lot of the sort of, decomposition and the deconstruction of a lot of the slave quarters in the South. So I think about, I think about the plantation generally as a stage. Now, who here has been, and I do a lot of public history work as well, who here has been to a plantation museum or as a docent and either have said or heard the story about fireplaces being outside because of fire and the smell of that food, right? So every single one of those narratives that you hear at pretty much every plantation museum I've been to, and I've been to a lot, comes from this 1705 quote. All their drudgeries of cookery, washing, dairies, etc. are performed in offices detached from their dwelling houses, which by this means are kept more cool and sweet. So I want you to think about this pragmatically for a second, right? And it was funny enough, I was at Stratford Hall yesterday and I got a tour, and the docent told me that on average, during the 18th and 19th century, people bathed about twice a year. White folks, like, dressing nice, they wash their hands and their face. But you're talking about a period in time when one's husband probably didn't smell that great. Let's just be honest. You probably didn't smell that great. Your kids were definitely stinky because they're running around playing outside all day long. Imagine that in Virginia heat in the summertime with no air conditioning. Your husband's been riding a horse all day and he comes home and you're worried about the smell of the turkey in the house. So you start thinking about this and you're like, wait a second, this doesn't quite add up, right? Moreover, there's hearths in every one of these bedrooms and rooms in these big mansions. In the wintertime, they're running constantly. So what is it really? Why is it that they move those kitchens outside? Well, architectural historians and archaeologists and some just regular old traditional historians have done a lot of research, and I've confirmed it, that during this era, by the end of the 1600s, right about 1705, indentured servitude was going down, enslaved African labor was coming up, and they actually designated a separate space, which was a reflection of the ways in which these architects and planters wanted to define race. So race really became a concept during this period. Before that, it was just, 17th century Virginia was Wild West, right? People were intermarrying, there were free blacks, it was just kind of all over the place. By the 18th century, the notion of race became very solidified, and you see that in the marcations of the buildings actually being separated from the main house. And I'm going to come back to this later with a similar quote from a more recent time. So we talked about the plantation, we talked about how the kitchen actually moved out from the inside of the house, and some plantation homes have, and I'm talking about these big plantation homes. The smaller ones you find out here, that's not the focus of my work. I'm talking about the big ones on the James River, places like Stratford Hall, Monticello, Mount Vernon, even Poplar Forest. Excuse me. So there's a political axis that was happening as well. And there was 3 periods where things really shifted, right, in the actual homes of these people that held slaves. The first was that period I just talked about when race became a concept and they started building outbuildings for the enslaved people. The second came right about the Revolutionary War period, when we became a new nation and our forefathers were really struggling with the slavery question. What do we do? We're a new nation. Can we, can we all be created equal? Give me liberty or give me death? Who does that actually apply to? So you start to see a shift in the architecture right after the Revolutionary War period. And you see this, Thomas Jefferson is a good example of this, but others do this as well. You see this with things like the dumbwaiter, where, if you have a way, and this thing right here, like the more traditional dumbwaiter that we think about, if you have a way, say if you're a president or a head of state of some sort, and you have someone coming to your house for dinner who might be from a nation or a colony that doesn't support slavery anymore, you don't really want to show off your enslaved population the same way you would if, Madison's coming over for dinner, right? So these kinds of things, these very fancy, right, tier tables and these dumbwaiters were allowed the planters to flex whether or not they wanted to show, or mask whether they wanted to show off their enslaved labor or not. And you think about the conversations that were happening as well, conversations about manumission, about the morality of slavery. You don't want your literate, somewhat educated, domestic enslaved people listening to that kind of rhetoric. Now, when the transatlantic slave trade ended in 1807, you have another weird thing that kind of happened in these larger plantation homes. You see a rise, and this happened at Montpelier, they ended up taking it down. There's a lot of other plantation homes that I've seen in Virginia that right around the early 19th century started putting up these hidden passageways, right? This is the famous one, of course, at excuse me, at Monticello. Now you can say, oh, well, that was just inspired by European architecture, that's why they did it. Well, European architecture was a very convenient way of actually dealing with a plantation that had enslaved people on it. So it was, it's both. Yes, of course it was influenced, but it also functioned in a way that was beneficial to the people who held these plantations. Now who here, thank you, who here has been to Berkeley Plantation in Charleston County? Not one of you. This is the first time I have my first mouse that came to my lecture. I have the first almost massive projector messed up. No one here has been, I feel like getting a bus and taking you all down there and looking at the sign in person. Okay, well, Charles City County, Berkeley Plantation. I have been on that tour, oh my goodness, I want to say once a year for at least 10 years. At least. It's in Charles City County, down on Route 5. If you drive down 64 towards Norfolk, there's a big old sign that says, Jamesburg Plantations. It's one of the big ones. I always say, and I've talked to them about this and I want to help, I've always said that it's the tour that I love to hate. Because every time I go on that thing, I just think it's been, and at this point, my first time there was in the 90s. So it's been actually, I'm getting old, it's been about 20 years where I've been seeing the tour and not much has changed. And one of their gems is this sign right here, the Whistling Walk Underground Passage. They give you what I call the wallpaper tour of the house, where it's all about, the details, which, sure, it's interesting. Let me know where that wallpaper came from. But as a cultural and historical, and a cultural and social historian, give me some stories. I want to know about the people, and not just the white folks. I want to know about everybody, right? So they continue to do this very sterile tour. They lead you out. Now, Berkeley Plantation has an underground passageway from the kitchen to the main house. Now, that's not an architectural gem. That's something else going on, too. You really think about that. They say, they point to the sign and they say, well, it's to protect the slaves from the rain. Now, anyone who spends more than 2 seconds reading anything about slavery knows that rain was not a big concern for the people who were enslaved. They had holes in the roof in the slave quarters. It's nonsense, right? The other thing that they say, which is actually illustrated here in this horrible little silhouette up there, is that they actually whistled while they walked. And everybody chuckles and they all disperse, and I'm sitting there every time just waiting for someone to say something about it, and no one ever does. So the story is that they would make them whistle while they walked to the main house to prevent the cooks from tasting the food. Who here has worked in a restaurant? Who here has cooked a meal for somebody else? Do you touch the food? Do you taste it? Right? Enslaved cooks were intimately involved with the cooking of these meals. They didn't have fancy Hobarts and things. They're sitting there, they're cutting the fat with their rough knife and they're, kneading bread by hand. So the idea, right, that one, rain was a concern, and that two, somehow that they made them whistle as if anyone would do that to keep from tasting the food, it makes you ask some questions, right? So I found out about this. These narratives popped up during the Jim Crow era. This is the Jim Crow era sign. And Jim Crow, and I argue this, it did so many strange things to the narrative of slavery in our country. Because African Americans and white folks were living sometimes right up against each other for hundreds of years. Then all of a sudden they couldn't use the same water fountains. All of a sudden they couldn't sit near each other on the bus. So there was something very strange that happened during the Jim Crow era that erased people's memories, that people were actually living very close to one another. There wasn't equality, but they were living close to each other. So this sign is a way that the Jim Crow era tried to sterilize that relationship, to promote the separate but unequal, right? Separate and unequal clause that really made Jim Crow stick so hard. This promotes African Americans, one, like I said, not being intimately involved with food. Two, that they are untrustworthy, that somehow that they would, you can't trust them to not taste a little piece of chicken as they're walking inside of the house. And these kinds of stereotypes very much are alive now. So to feed this kind of Jim Crow mythology to a tour in 2016 is problematic. All right, so we talked about plantation tours, we talked about the houses and the kitchens being moved out. Now I'm going to take you inside of a plantation home, all all right? Thinking about it as the front stage. I want you to get your historical imagination completely fired up. I mean, turn it on full blast. I want you to think of that Gone with the Wind plantation, right? Big tables, fancy dresses. And all of you need to imagine yourself as a white person who's free, because it's not going to be the same experience if you're not. So imagine that experience, walking into that plantation. The Virginia reel is going on, there's a huge supper. You're going to sit there and you're going to feast, you're going to have a 15-course meal, and it is going to be divine. You're drinking brandy. It's beautiful, right? I want you to imagine this. This is very much the narrative that we get when we think about plantation homes. When we think about the food at these plantation homes. Part of this is that the mistress, the white woman who ran the house, cooked it all too, right? It's her food. Granted, a lot of the recipes, sure, came from her or Mary Randolph or someone similar. But there's this want to think of the mistress as being the one who actually cooked it all. And this, in some ways, is a very sort of, 20th century model. My mother was a housewife, right? She never had a job. And she cooked every meal. And even for her generation, she was born in 1932, for her generation, this was an exciting thing to go hear about. I want to go see a plantation museum to hear about the story of the white women, right? Because that needs to be told too. But it's not quite as clear as they present it. Also think of an abundance of food, French-inspired, multiple courses, weekly dinners, sometimes up to 100 people these enslaved folks had to cook for. These balls. So I have a quote for you. It's pretty fancy, right? Pretty fancy. Everyone's got their taffeta ready to go, their ribbons and their hair. Now that's the image that people like to present. Now I'm going to read you a little gem that I found in a letter written from a woman who visited Virginia in 1780. This is the height, this is, 1780s. This is the colonial era. These homes they were popping. They were, seriously beautiful things happening there for white folks. This woman wrote, "Another peculiarity of this country," talking about the United States, Virginia specifically, "is the absence of napkins." Yes. Even in the homes of the wealthy, napkins as a whole are never used. And one has to wipe one's mouth on the tablecloth, which in consequence suffers in appearance. Now this woman traveled all over the South in Virginia, and this is her takeaway, is that these fancy Virginians with their big dresses and their fancy food are sitting there with gravy on their chin, just, dipping down to the tablecloth. So I just, I use this in a way with the front stage to kind of break that myth too, because it's kind of hilarious. And in some ways, when you hear this kind of stuff, you feel a little bit more, connected to these people that are supposed to be so royal, Like, oh, well, they were wiping their, their food on their hand or whatever else. This is really important. So one of the main, theses or points of my work, and this is where I talk about the importance of framing enslaved cooks with this larger entertainment culture, because that's very much where they're situated, right? They're not in the field, they're in the middle of all of this. Dining was a cultural commodity. Because of the importance of food in showing off your wealth, if you had, certain, certain courses or certain items on your table, you were definitely, just same way now, right? If you go to someone's house and they're giving you, lobster ravioli and caviar, you're drinking like the most expensive wine, you know that person has money, right? At least enough for that meal. The same thing was happening then. So these cooks were at the center of this. Men and women, they were courting one another, or men were courting women. And these women that I read, their diaries and their letters to one another were very worried, right? We have to make sure the dinner on Saturday is perfect because, Mr. Johnson's coming over for Charlotte. And so these cooks were at the center of the pedigree, in some ways, the success of these white families, because food was the essence during this period. Now the mistress, this is Mrs. Bird right here, from down there, one of those James River, plantations. The mistress was in charge of a lot of things, right? And I'm not saying that they cooked all the food, because they didn't. But they definitely did what was called carrying the keys. They would come down in the morning, they would unlock things like the sugar, the spices. This is not all of them. Some enslaved cooks had the right and the power to do that as well. But they would come down and sort of, look over things, and then they would go off. And I read their letters. They were not down there in the kitchen. They're writing to everybody and their mama about the weather, about their Latin that they read, about what kind of sickness their children have, right? So, and a bunch of other things as well. So they would come down, they would ration. Now the cook had a lot of power, and not only when things were served, but what was served. I found evidence of women, enslaved women, who were sick and couldn't cook for a while. People putting off balls and dinners because Mary or Lucy was not feeling right. That kind of thing was not happening in the field. And if you were a maid in the house, that wasn't happening either. So these women and some of the men that worked in the house had the ability to, whether play sick or not, carve out moments where they could push back, a little resistance. Just like people in the field would break tools or play dumb, these people in the house would be sick, right? And not be able to perform a certain kind of skill to make sure the mistress looked good. So there's one more thing too that is very central to this relationship, this very nuanced relationship between these mistresses and these enslaved cooks. And it was the threat of poisoning. I have to say, this was one of the more fun parts of my research, was reading, not that I'm trying to kill everybody, I'm not, but it was really interesting because when enslaved people go to court, which was rare, because typically things just were handled on a plantation and that was it. When they actually make it to court, their testimonies are written down. So in some ways, it's the only way to capture their voices during this period. So I had an incredibly rich experience reading through the court cases to see exactly what happened, and you'll have to buy my book when it comes out because there's some crazy stuff that happens. But the people from West Africa, you think about the period of slavery, you had, 1619, 20-odd Negroes were brought to Jamestown, all the way up to 1865. You've got people enslaved working in these homes. The earlier period, you're going to have a lot of West Africans that brought with them not only their knowledge of food and taste and skills of their own that contributed to the food that we now think of Southern food, but they also brought with them knowledge of medicine and poison. Now, a lot of the medicine that was done during this period, and even the caretaking of the white family, was done by black folks. The medical field is a very recent thing as far as we think of it now. 19th century is when doctors really became, mainstream in a lot of ways. If you're talking about the colonial era, you're going to go down to the little drugstore place and get your little powder and take it. So these cookbooks that I've read, the handwritten ones, not the ones that are published, the ones that are sitting there in the archives that are amazing. The first 2/3 are recipes, right? Those recipes changed. 18th century it was mostly white, but the 19th century you got okra, you got pepper pot, you got a ton of African food in there. And then the last part of it is medicine. Now these enslaved cooks were not only making the medicine, but they were administering the medicine. And the difference between medicine and poison is dosage, period. You take too much Advil, you're done, you're in the ER. So you think about the kind of trust that these white folks had for the people who were feeding them. They didn't have needles. You couldn't run in there and inject somebody with poison because those weren't even invented yet. Also, germ theory wasn't around. So a lot of these folks might not even have tried to poison their enslaver. There are testimonies of people that absolutely did try to do that. And that's what I have in my book. But you had one way to get it in, it was through the food. And so this kept, in some ways, the white mistresses walking a little softer around that cook, because they had to. And this allowed the cooks to do things like demand and get certain food things, living conditions that were in some ways better than the ones in the quarter. Their family could live with them in the kitchens. Their real family, like their blood family, which wasn't the case. They were able to be traded less during domestic slave trade. There were a lot of things that they were able to do because of this. Now I'm going to take you backstage. So front stage is that, napkin quote, it's those halls, it's the big dresses. I want to take you into the actual kitchens where these folks worked 24 hours a day, where they lived. Now when I teach I love asking my students, would you rather think back to the period of slavery? If you were an enslaved person, would you be in the field or would you be in the house? 99% of the people were like, I'll be in the house. They were treated better, the work was less crazy. Then you got the one person that's like, nope, I want my, ability to like not see white people at night, I'm gonna be in the corner, right? And then I give them the talk and they think to themselves, and then it's completely different. You got one person or two people that might want to be in the house. Kind of a weird thing that happens with that. But, like I said at the beginning of my lecture too, being called a house slave or an Uncle Tom is an incredible insult. There's a lot of baggage with this notion as well. So I want you to imagine yourself, you're in the kitchen, you're dressed the men and women wore these sort of dress kind of skirts with an apron. They would wet the skirt so that it wouldn't catch on fire. Now they are lifting, this is not the day of, all clad, that's actually heavy, like aluminum, cookware. We're talking about cast iron pots and skillets and Dutch ovens. We're talking about roasting entire pigs on a spit, moving that. Heavy, hard work, up and down, up and down. The burns. Burning was one of the #1 causes of death amongst enslaved cooks. The hours, like I said, depending on who was coming. If somebody came and visited the home at 2 in the morning on horseback, you had to get up, bell would ring, someone would run out there and say, make this person some biscuits right now. So you were constantly on call, you were watched over all the time. I'm going to give you 2 recipes. This is where I bring in my former chef eyeballs, right? This is where I think about the recipes as clues to labor, right? So when I see a recipe, I can immediately think that's going to take me 10 minutes, or there's no way in the world I'm cooking that, I'll be here till tomorrow, right? Everything in between. And for those of you who cook, know exactly what I'm talking about. So when I started reading these recipes for dishes that were one of like 15, 20 that were to be served, because I saw the menus, and I started to read these thinking, okay, there was a cook, maybe an assistant cook, and a couple of kids helping out. Oyster stew. That is one of the most popular and delicious, but popular dishes that was served as one of the courses in Virginia. You were going to eat it, especially down in the Chesapeake. That was going to be on the table, one of many dishes. Now you say you got like 50 people coming to dinner, and you need about 400 oysters. That's one ingredient for one dish. Who here has shucked an oyster? It is not the easiest thing to do in the world, and I can't imagine that whatever tool they had was better than what we have now, which is still kind of pretty crude if you think about it. It's a piece of metal with a handle on it. But you got to shuck those things, you got to clean those things, you got to make the roux. Make sure the roux doesn't burn. I mean, making roux is a huge pain to do. Huge pain to do. It drives me crazy. And you're doing this all in the open flame. Meanwhile, you're baking pies and you're making puddings. Now what they would do too, the ovens, the way that they tested that is they would reach in, and if they could keep their hand in there for 20 seconds, it wasn't hot enough. So a lot of people, that's how they tested to see if it was hot enough to bake a cake. Or to bake, we have some stuff here, some recipes that we used, or I didn't use, somebody else got doing the Mistress thing here, I cooked it, somebody else cooked it, but they're over here, we're going to eat them later. But, the kinds of technology that we take for granted now just wasn't there. Another thing that I love to talk about is head cheese. And this is something that if you had head cheese on your plate, on your table, that was the caviar of the day. That took labor. It meant that you had a whole cow or a calf to kill. And the recipe is something, again, that really breaks down this notion of this beautiful plantation fare, right? So you've got, the recipe goes as this. You take a calf's head, you put it in lye and water, one of those cast iron pots. You bring it to a boil. You boil it for a while, and then you put it aside and let it sit there for a day or so. Once there's a thick layer of bubbles on the top, and we all know in 2016 that that's bacteria, and that is not some fancy, cheese that you want to eat. You just peel those bubbles off, then you take it out, strain it in cheesecloth, pick it out, press it down, and you've got meat jello. Hot dog jello, whatever else. Something else aside from those little racist Americana dolls, somebody always says afterwards, have you eaten it? I'll bring you some. And I'm like, no thank you. One person actually came to my talk twice and brought me some from Kroger, and I'm like, I'm really okay. I do not need to eat that in my life. I'll survive without it. So you've got this kind of food, and just imagine the kinds of labor that went into this, right? And like I said, so the one-pot meals, the gumbos, peanut soup, right? All of these things are African, and they're very much a part of what we think of as Virginia food. And so, you can romanticize Virginia food and think, oh, it's the Monticello, it's the French, it's the creme brulee. It's also the gumbo, and it's also, pepper pot, and ingredients like okra and sweet potatoes and watermelon came from West Africa. So we have to give credit where credit's due and realize that, again, like I was saying in the beginning, everyone was living very close to one another, and the cultures were interacting in ways not remembered correctly in the 21st century. I want to pause for a moment and introduce you to two enslaved cooks. There are several in my book that I found information on. The frustrating part of what I did with the book is, most plantations have a name and age, and that's it. And so I had to really work collectively to figure out what the essence of these experiences were. Luckily, a few of these cooks actually have some narratives around them. I'm going to start off with the one on the left. And I was very torn, and I actually want to take a poll real fast because yesterday there was a big old discussion about this. Show of hands, for the cover of my book, I paid for this thing to be on there. I had a bunch of people that wants this. Who likes the one on the left more than the right? Who likes Hercules? Man. All right, well, no decisions there. We'll talk about it later. So anyways, the woman on the right. Now in 1856, a man by the name of David Hunter Strother traveled around. He was writing for the Harper's New Monthly magazine. Traveled around the South, did some really cool stuff. He was traveling around before the Civil War, just recording stuff. He was from up north. He thought the South was this weird place. He was writing these stories. And he found himself in Amherst County, in between here and Lynchburg. I drive past today when I came up here. He found himself in Amherst County in a tavern. And he decided to stay an extra day and have this woman, who was the enslaved cook, drawn. And he described her, as such. That the cook belongs to the type of class whose skill is not of books or training, but a gift both rich and rare, who has grown sleek and fat on the steam of her own genius, whose children have the first dip in all gravies, the exclusive right to all livers and gizzards, not to mention the breasts of fried chickens. So this woman has no name. She has a description. I have actually spent hours and hours, actually days in Amherst County trying to figure out which plantation she belonged to. I've had absolutely no luck. It was right down the road. Now there's Hercules, who I spend a decent amount of my book talking about because I feel like, James Hemings has had a lot of attention. Hercules has a pretty spectacular story as well. There was a book that came out this year, I think, maybe about I don't know, it was this year sometime. It was that horrible children's book, baking Mr. Washington a birthday cake or something, and it was like the happy slave Hercules. It was a mess. So anyways, again, we're starting with this information. So, let me get some notes. Hercules was born in 1754. George Washington bought him when he was 16 years old. He worked at Mount Vernon as a house servant for a decade before he moved into the kitchen. By 1786, he was the age of 32, and he was cooking alongside a man named Nathan at Mount Vernon. He married a woman named Alice, who was a seamstress at Mount Vernon. They had 3 children, Richmond, Evie, and Delia. Soon after his last child was born, his wife passed away, and George Washington moved himself and a few of his enslaved people up to Philadelphia to run the country. Now, in 1791, he moved there. Now, in 1790, there was the Gradual Emancipation Act in Pennsylvania, which enforced any owners of slaves to emancipate their enslaved people after 6 months if they remained in the state. Now, George Washington didn't realize this. He goes up there thinking, I got my cooks, I'm ready to go, I'm going to entertain. And then he has letters, people saying, George, just so you know, you can't do this. You got to bring them back. Like every 5 months and 28 days, you got to, stick them on a boat or whatever, get them back to touch the Virginia soil. and then come back to Philadelphia. So Hercules spent 4 years there. And during those 4 years, there's a description of him, which I absolutely love. And again, it's the moments where you can find descriptive pieces on enslaved people that really speak to their personality, to their look. Check this out. This is described by George Washington Parke Custis, who remembered him and had stories about him. In making his toilet in the bathroom, his linen was of exceptional whiteness and quality, so he's getting dressed. So it's part of this too is he would run the kitchen seamlessly. And when it was time for him to be done, dinner was served, he would go to the bathroom and get ready. And this is what he would put on before he would stroll down the streets of Philadelphia, which had a vibrant free black community. His linen was of exceptional whiteness and quality. Black silk shorts, ditto waistcoat, ditto stockings, shoes highly polished, with large buckles covering a considerable part of his foot. So he's like wearing silk and linen. Blue cloth coat with a velvet collar and bright metal buttons, a long watch chain dangling from his fob, a cocked hat, and check this out. This was written in the 1970s. A gold-headed cane complete the grand costume. So this man, talk about dignity, he was an enslaved person, worked in Washington's White House, and he walked down the street and white free men would bow to him when he would walk down the street. He sold his leftovers for hundreds of dollars a year because his food was so good and he was so respected. Now getting back to that gradual emancipation situation that George Washington got himself and his enslaved folks into. Now imagine this, every 5 months and 20 some odd days, Hercules, you gotta get on a wagon and go down and see the family for a little while, right? Hercules got wind of this. It's pretty obvious. He was out and about with all the free blacks that live in Philadelphia. He knew what was going on. Additionally, he very likely met other heads of state, people from Europe. People were coming through George Washington's house, complimenting him. He was well known, very well known. Every time George Washington sent Hercules back to Mount Vernon, which took over a day, days actually, on horseback or walking or on a wagon, he taught, inadvertently, Chef Hercules multiple ways to get out of Dodge. And at some point, something happened after the 4th year. Nobody knows what happened. He and George Washington had some kind of falling out, not sure. He was then in 1796, Hercules found himself back, after all of that, back on Mount Vernon shoveling manure. So something happened. I did a lot of research, nobody knows what happened. But on February, on the day of Washington's birthday, in 1797, he escaped. And he left. And no one knows what happened to him. The only clue that we have, this is why I love this picture so much, is this portrait that was found in Spain. And it says, Washington's Chef Hercules. So you guess. I think he found himself on a boat, took his butt to a place where he would never ever be enslaved again, and served the rest of his life for someone who paid him and gave him, hopefully, a proper ending of his life. So I'm going to switch over to the crossroads of all of this, right? We've got the African American folks who were enslaved in the kitchen. We've got the white folks in the big house coming together in the kitchen, kind of like a crossroads or a cultural access. You know, the white lady saying, oh, make those biscuits again, and them saying, okay, but I'm going to do it my way, I'm going to do this and that, right? These kitchens were very important spaces. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the archaeological evidence that I found that is, it's the essence of what their daily life was like. If you think about archaeology and the importance of archaeology, enslaved people were not allowed to read or write, unless they were, very rare you had someone who was allowed to do that. So the garbage, just like yourselves, there's a certain, word, and especially now it's a little bit different because of the internet, but people know your name, your age. Your records that are written are very basic. If someone goes through your garbage right now, when you're hearing this talk, they're going to know a lot about what you did in the last day or week, depending on how much garbage you take out, right? They're going to know about if you have medications, what you eat, the sort of status of the food. that you eat as well. So I use archaeology to really shed light on the hidden lives of enslaved cooks. This is what I call kitchen archaeology. And I'm going to tell you about two different kitchens, collections that I looked at. I ended up looking at a lot more afterwards, and the evidence that I found was continually supported. The first was Dixon Plantation. It's in King and Queen County, Virginia. It was, excuse me, a mid-18th century detached kitchen. It burned in the 1760s. And it burned, and instead of putting another one on top of it, thank goodness they took all of the stuff and they put it in the cellar and they buried it and walked away. So it was a time capsule of information about what life was like the moment that house, that kitchen burned down. This right here is the stain. Those are the oyster shells that topped it. This went down 6 feet. It had hundreds of thousands of artifacts in there. I mean, so much. It was, and the people that dug this they're who I'm working for now, but they have worked seriously on some of the most amazing sites, including Jamestown. They said it was the best feature they've ever dug. There were swords in there. They had swords on the fireplace. Again, sort of reimagining these enslaved cooks with a little bit more trust, a little bit more power than you might think. In this pit, they had some pretty awesome stuff. So in addition, I had to go through tons of stuff. I had to go through a bunch of funnel remains, the bones, and everything else, a bunch of brick, things that I just didn't care about. Then the really juicy stuff popped up. This right here is a modified West African cowrie shell, sitting next to a pile of fish scales. Over here, we've got a European-style emerald ring. Similarly, over here, we've got European jewelry adornment and West African jewelry and adornment. Now, moreover, you expect to find sort of, European items. There might have been laundry in there, things falling off clothes, whatever else. But these items right here speak directly to the retentions from West Africa that were in that kitchen and on the cook's body or the family of the cook. So these things right here, these West African cowrie shells have been modified so the back was rubbed off so you could wear them on a string or in your hair or around your ankle. These were used to ward off evil spirits for religious reasons or simply just as gifts from people probably in West Africa before they left and were captured and sold to Virginia. We've got West African beads and a pierced coin. Now the pierced coin is incredibly significant. So a lot of slave owners would give their enslaved folks on Christmas, give them, an old Spanish coin, or something that random, right, that had no value to them. But, here's a little bit of money, you can take this. Enslaved folks in West Africa, before they were brought over, and a lot of the religions over there and the cultures, they would take shiny things, pierce a hole in it, and wear it around their neck, put it in their house to ward off evil spirits. So this is like an evil eye kind of thing. So you've got a Spanish coin given to them, very likely, by the plantation owner, then reused to turn into an evil eye to protect them from spirits. This is in the 18th century, right? So, you can say, okay, well, there's still West Africans coming over there. The 19th century hasn't turned everyone to Christians yet, so that's, we can buy this, right? Sorry. And I'm going to get back to that in a second. Something else that we found in there, I found this in the written record, and the archaeology supported that, and that's one of the most beautiful things when you're able to have a complementary relationship with what you read, and then all of a sudden you see things in the earth. So during my research, and it's in the book, I found evidence of the kitchen being this place where the field hands would come up at night, because that cook was cooking all night. So the field hands would come up, hang out with the cook at night while they were cooking, talk, drink sometimes, eat whatever leftovers were there. Similarly, there's a lot of records of some of the white children and the teenagers going down, like, oh, Harry's down there in the kitchen again tonight, drinking and playing, banjo with the slaves. And so you have this place that's very socially active, right? Culturally mixed. Again, breaking that Jim Crow era idea out of our heads. They had wedding receptions in kitchens for the enslaved people. Records of them stopping work for a day, having the kitchen be used as a place to not only get married, but to have the food afterwards. And that's for not just the people in the house, but the folks in the quarter as well. Right here, we've got evidence of marbles and pieces that have been ground down to possibly play mancala or wari, the West African game. So the evidence is pretty clear that, at least in this kitchen, it matches with some of the records I've heard from other kitchens. Now this right here is, excuse me, from an actual plantation kitchen in Virginia. And I found this, and I was very excited about it. This is a Christian Mayer painting from the 19th century. It's the kitchen at White Sulphur Springs, which is now West Virginia. Now, this is somebody just went in there and painted this one day, right? You've got the presumed master over here speaking with somebody. I'm not sure what's going on there. And I don't know if this is a wedding or what's going on, but you have evidence right here of the space being very different than just for food. So it's a really important building on these plantations, and it was a really important building during that period. I want to take you to my last plantation site that I'm going to tell you about the archaeology of. It's the Wilcox Kitchen in Flower 200, the same plantation I went to when I was 17 and shocked me into something. Right over here is Emmanuel Jones. He was the enslaved cook there right before the Civil War. And Emmanuel Jones' story is pretty fantastic. He was, first of all, he was known in the county as the little black magician. He was very short. His biscuits were so good, it was like magic. People loved his food. He would sell his food just like Hercules. Now when the Civil War came around, and he gave her the option to stay on or leave, he said, I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to cook, you're going to pay me. He did not have to get into the trap of sharecropping. He used his skills as a cook to actually make enough money from the Wilcoxes to move to Petersburg to buy land where his family was buried. He's buried there, and I'm still trying to track them down. I've had very little luck. But the story to him, at least through into the early 20th century, is he ended up having a decent life after he was freed because of his skills. Now this is a 19th century kitchen that was excavated in the 1980s by my dad, funny enough. And during the 1980s, archaeologists didn't know a lot about West African religion. It was like, oh my goodness, we have a slave quarter, let's take as many notes as possible and hope we don't mess this up, right? Thankfully, we're in a better position now. Now, when I was going through the artifacts, which are actually here in Charlottesville, when I was going through the artifacts, here's the footprint of the kitchen. Here's where the hearth was. That's where the little laundry was. When I was going through the kitchen, I found an amethyst crystal and a little bag of white shells. And it said they were found in the northwest quadrant of the kitchen hearth. And I thought to myself, this is familiar, what's going on here? And through some research, and I found other caches as well, these artifacts were placed there to practice hoodoo. It was a West African religion, and it was brought over. It was a mix of Protestantism and West African ancestor belief. And they would bury little things like crystals and bones and shells in that certain point of the hearth or in the building, and it would protect them from spirits. They would conjure their ancestors. They would do root work, put spells on people. A lot of spells would be put on a lot of people. I'm going to tell you right now in my book, there was a lot, it's like you can't poison the master, but we're going to put a spell on him by putting some in his milk, putting someone underneath the doorstep that he walked through. So this is a mid-19th century kitchen, right? Most people think by the mid-19th century when the Civil War came, all these enslaved folks were 100%, were with Jesus, that's it. This right here, with a lot of other stuff that I found, proves that they definitely practiced Christianity, but they did not let go of their ancestral ways. They did not forget what their ancestors brought over with them. That even in the landscape of the white plantation house, these cooks were very much attached to their ancestors, to their home culture, and they did not lose that because they moved into the main house. Now, I told you in the beginning when I had that wonderful 1705 quote that I was going to read something, and I want to also touch on the fact that Jim Crow era did a lot of really weird things. Now, this is an Ivory Soap ad from 1892, and the language is so small, I'm going to read it out loud because you'll go blind. Here are some servant steps. Also, when I go to plantation museums, I don't care about the grand stairwells. I want to see the servant steps. Because I'm going to tell you right now, you can see look at those things. They're worn down, right? So you can see clues to the African American past in the landscape through things like worn brick in a hearth or in a kitchen, through worn floorboards, through steps that probably were, traveled on 20, 30 more times a day than those of the white folks in the front of the house. And so this ad right here, Ivory So Bad, it says to keep dining private and hotel cars free from disagreeable odor. So another instance where you've got this notion of blackness and labor and smells being boarded off and closed off from the white passengers. And you can take this and you can think about contemporary examples, but this at least is one from the Jim Crow era, a good 40 years before that sign was put up that we saw earlier, but again, more evidence of that weird rewriting of what actually happened during slavery. So I end with a slide because I think it's important. You've got these images from the turn of the century that are very much celebrating the happy cook, the happy slave. Then you've got more contemporary pieces that are a little bit more nuanced. You've got Aunt Jemima with a broom and a shotgun. And, I think it's important to put these two things next to one another, right? Because surely there were enslaved folks who were probably more loyal to the white family. But there were also ones that were putting, arsenic in their milk. And so, to think about history not as this binary thing, but as a very fluid and nuanced relationship between these people for hundreds of years. I redefine, and I want you to remember, that these enslaved cooks were agents. They had agency. They had dignity. They had pride, and they had some kind of control during moments when they were held in bondage. I also want to really stress the fact that they transformed Southern cuisine as well to very much reflect West African food. And at some point, you need to give due not just to the people who cooked it, but the food that they produced that we consider now to be Southern food generally, that people like Paula Deen can serve without talking about these ideas and this history of race. Thank you.
Extend to you personal thanks for what you did. This is incredible because I am an American and I do not know so much of what you talk about. It's very important. You're telling your life. Thank you very much.